I always thought my grandpa, Richard Hale, was just an old-fashioned man with too many rules and too much pride in the Hale family name. Growing up in New Jersey, our family gatherings always felt stiff, polite, and a little too perfect. My dad, Charles, was the golden son, the one who followed every rule and stayed close to Grandpa's business. My mom played the role of the supportive wife, though she often had a quiet sadness in her eyes, especially whenever Grandpa entered the room. I, on the other hand, was the outlier, 28 years old, working as a freelance designer, scraping through rent payments in Brooklyn, and carrying the unspoken label of the disappointment. When Grandpa called me one spring afternoon, it caught me off guard. He never called me directly. He was the kind of man who'd send a handwritten letter before touching a phone. "Ethan," he said in his deep, gravelly voice, "I need you to come to the estate this weekend. There's something we should discuss, something about your trust fund." I remember laughing awkwardly, assuming he was joking. "Trust fund? Grandpa, I can barely afford a Metro card." There was silence. Then that slow, deliberate chuckle of his. "You really don't know, do you?" He said, "Interesting. I'll see you Saturday." When the call ended, I sat there staring at my cracked phone screen, wondering what he meant. My trust fund? It made no sense. My parents had never mentioned anything like that. If anything, they'd made it clear that Grandpa's money was off limits. Earned. Not given, as Dad liked to put it. I drove up to the estate that Saturday, the one sitting like a crown on the hill overlooking Morristown. The Hale mansion was a symbol of old money. Brick walls, iron gates, manicured lawns that smelled like money itself. I hadn't been there in years. The last time was during Grandma's funeral, and even then I stayed on the edge. Feeling like a stranger in my own bloodline, Grandpa was waiting in the library, a place filled with dust, mahogany, and memories that never belonged to me. He looked older than I remembered, his silver hair thinner, his frame smaller, but his eyes sharp and calculating. Hadn't dulled a bit. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the leather chair opposite his. "Tell me, Ethan, how do you spend your $3,400,000 trust fund?" For a moment, I thought he was testing me. I blinked, confused. "What trust fund?" The look on his face shifted from amusement to something much darker, like the clouds that roll in before a storm. He leaned back slowly, clasping his hands. "Your father told me you'd been using the money irresponsibly. That's why I've been watching you. But judging by that expression, I'd say he lied." I felt my throat tighten. "Wait, what do you mean he lied? There's a trust fund?" He opened a folder from the desk drawer and slid a few documents toward me. My name, Ethan Charles Hale, was printed across the top of a trust deed signed when I was 15. The amount, $3,400,000. The trustee's signature, Charles Hale, my father. It felt like the room tilted. My father had been the trustee, meaning he'd been managing that money all these years. And I had no idea. Grandpa's voice cut through my spinning thoughts. "The fund was meant to support you until you found your own footing. But if you're saying you never saw a dime..." He paused. "Then it appears your father's been siphoning it off." My chest burned with disbelief. That can't be right. Dad he wouldn't steal from me. Grandpa's expression softened only slightly. He would if he believed it was his to control. "Your father has always had an inflated sense of entitlement. I warned him once, never touch what isn't his. But Charles never listens." I sat there staring at the papers, feeling anger and confusion war inside me. My father, the man who lectured me about responsibility, had been living off the money that was mine all along. It wasn't just betrayal, it was hypocrisy wrapped in years of lies. Grandpa stood up and walked to the window. "I'm dying, Ethan," he said quietly. "Doctors say it's a matter of months. I can't leave this world without setting things right." He turned to me. "I want you to find out exactly what your father did with that trust. And when you do, I'll make sure he never touches another cent of this family's wealth." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car outside the mansion watching the lights go out one by one. My mind raced with every memory of my father telling me we couldn't afford college help, or that I needed to learn financial independence. Every excuse suddenly made sense. The business trips, the new lake house, the quiet luxury. He'd been living off my future. Over the next week, I started digging, quietly. Grandpa's attorney, Mr. Banks, gave me limited access to the financial records tied to my name. What I found made my stomach twist. Transfers from the trust account into shell companies owned by my father's firm. Payments for consulting fees, and even direct withdrawals signed by him, $3.4 million. Gone. I drove to my parents' house one night, heart pounding. Mom greeted me with her usual soft smile, but I could tell something in her eyes had changed since Grandpa's call. She'd always seemed caught between loyalty and fear. "Mom," I said, gripping the documents in my hand, "did you know about this?" Her face went pale. "Ethan, please, don't start." "Don't start what?" "Asking why my father stole $3 million from me." She flinched like I'd struck her. "He didn't steal it," she whispered. He said you weren't ready, that if you had that kind of money you'd waste it. He promised he was saving it for when you were older, more stable." I laughed bitterly. "He's been using it for himself, Mom. Look at these records." She stared at the papers, her lips trembling. "I didn't know," she said finally, tears welling in her eyes. "I swear, Ethan, I didn't know." My father came home an hour later. The moment he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, he froze. Then he smiled, tight, practiced. "Well, this is a surprise." "Cut the act," I said, sliding the papers toward him. "You want to tell me why my trust fund is empty?" His face didn't change right away, but I saw a flicker, panic before the mask slipped back into place. "You're misunderstanding, son. That money was under my management. I invested it. For your future." "Then where is it?" He sighed. "These things take time, Ethan. You don't just withdraw millions overnight." "The market." "Stop lying," I snapped. "I talked to Grandpa. He knows everything." That hit him hard. His jaw tightened. "He had no right to involve you in this." "No right?" "It was my money." The argument spiraled, voices rising, years of buried resentment spilling out. My mother sobbed quietly by the sink, her hands shaking. My father finally slammed his fist on the table. "You think you deserve that money? You couldn't even keep a steady job. You'd have blown it all in a year." I stood. "Maybe, but it was still mine." He didn't answer. He just stared at me with that cold, superior look I'd seen my whole life, the one that told me I'd never measure up. I left that night furious but determined. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make sure he paid for every lie, every manipulation, every stolen dollar. With Grandpa's help, I filed a legal request to audit the trust. The lawyers dug deep, and what they found was worse than I expected. Forged signatures, falsified investment reports, and illegal transfers. My father had built his entire business empire on my inheritance. The first blow came when Grandpa called a family meeting. He gathered everyone, my parents, my uncle, my cousins, in the dining hall that always smelled faintly of old money and arrogance. He stood at the head of the table, frail but fierce. "Charles," he said, voice steady, "I gave you authority over Ethan's trust because I believed you were honorable. I was wrong." Dad tried to interrupt, but Grandpa held up a hand. "The evidence is undeniable. You stole from your own son. You betrayed this family. Effective immediately, you are removed from all Hale holdings. The company shares you manage will be transferred." The silence was suffocating. My father's face went white. "You can't do this," he said hoarsely. "I already have," Grandpa replied. "And as for you, Ethan, you'll take over the role of managing partner once my estate transitions." It was surreal. Years of humiliation, of being treated like the family failure, suddenly flipped. My father glared at me, hatred burning in his eyes. But beneath that fury I saw something else. Fear. That night, Grandpa pulled me aside. "He won't take this lightly," he said. "Be careful. Men like your father don't lose quietly." He was right. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. My email got hacked. My freelance accounts froze due to fraud reports. Anonymous messages warned me to stay out of family business. But I didn't stop. I gathered more proof, backed up every file, every bank record, every email. I even found out that my father had been manipulating Grandpa's company books for years, padding profits, faking expenses. By the time I confronted him again, I wasn't just a betrayed son. I was armed with the truth, and that's where the real revenge began. I remember the moment everything narrowed down to a single line of choice. I could have torn my father apart in front of everyone, screamed until his pride was a puddle on the marble floor. I could have taken pleasure in the small, private cruelties that years of humiliation had earned me the right to inflict. Instead, I breathed, counted to 10, and let the plan that had been forming in the back of my head for weeks fall into place. First, I shut everything down that could be used against me. Grandpa insisted on hiring a private forensic accountant, a woman named Claire Moreno who smelled faintly of peppermint and certainty. Claire did what the lawyers could not in the first pass. She walked through ledgers and invoices, testified in ways numbers rarely lie. She mapped the money trail like a cartographer of betrayal. Payment here, shell company there. A pattern of withdrawals thin as a spider's thread that led straight to my father's accounts, and to the secret life he'd been living for 15 years. Claire found luxury vacations booked through a consulting company, renovations on the second house disguised as capital improvements, personal loans repaid through phantom clients. She found falsified consulting contracts signed with the same tremor of my father's hand. Second, I tightened my alliances. Family meetings had already shaken the usual loyalties loose. Grandpa's cold, careful authority had fractured the automatic defense my parents mounted around Charles. My mother, devastated but finally awake, began to remember small oddities she'd buried. Receipts shuffled into drawers, the way my father's voice got clipped when I mentioned anything remotely financial. She wept and then she steeled. For the first time in my life, my mother looked at my father and saw him clearly. Third, I used what Grandpa could still give: public pressure. He had influence in ways I did not. Board seats, philanthropic contacts, people who still respected the name Hale. Grandpa and I drafted a letter to the company's board revealing what we knew, accompanied by Claire's forensic report. We sent secure copies to the state attorney's white-collar crime unit and to one journalist whose work on corporate fraud had made him both feared and respected. We were deliberate. No slander, only facts we could prove in court. The choice to go public felt like a moral one, as if I were deciding whether to set a match to a house. But the house had flames already. Exposing them was the only way to make sure they didn't spread to others. When the news hit, it moved faster than any of us expected. Headlines lunged, family dynasty rocked by embezzlement. The board called an emergency meeting. Stock, if you could call what the company had, wavered. My father's calm evaporated into a fog of excuses. Outside the boardroom, men and women who had once smiled in his presence looked at him with something like disgust. Inside, his allies, longtime associates who had benefited from the same system, scrambled. I watched them from the gallery, a hole of cold satisfaction opening where pain had lived for years. The board vote was swift. Grandpa's voice carried more weight than I guessed it would. He moved with a determination that surprised both of us. The disease had not stolen his convictions. This family's name is not a blank check, he told the room. We will not stand by men who steal from their kin and their stakeholders. The board stripped my father of his roles and froze his access to company accounts. They installed an interim management team and appointed Claire to work with corporate auditors. They also instituted a temporary injunction on the most suspicious assets, which meant the second house and several bank accounts were now tethered to the investigation, instead of to my father's leather belt. He tried a variety of tactics. At first he tried to charm his way back, long honeyed apologies promising restitution. When that failed, he threatened. Threats were new for him. He was more used to paternal lectures than to intimidation. He hired lawyers who sent polite but ominous letters to Grandpa's attorneys. He hired private investigators to dig into me, trying to find dirt to paint me as an opportunist. The investigators came back with the usual: a list of my late-night freelance invoices, an ex-girlfriend who said I was messy with my time, a former roommate who had borrowed a shirt. Nothing they could use, then he escalated. Someone anonymously filed a complaint to my freelance platform accusing me of client fraud. My accounts froze, which forced me into a small panic that lasted days. There were late-night calls from blocked numbers, breathing, then silence. Once, my old bicycle was slashed in the stairwell. It felt petty and dangerous all at once, like a child throwing rocks at a train. I stopped flinching. I learned to expect his moves the way you learn to expect a pothole in a familiar street. When my freelance accounts froze, I called the platform's security team and walked them calmly through the evidence showing my work history and ownership of the designs they were accusing me of stealing. I reached out to old clients who were baffled by the claims and supportive. My phone company helped trace some of the calls. I kept every receipt, every screenshot, every detail that could be weaponized, because in a war fought with documents, the safest defenses are your own records. The second act of my plan was surgical, a bank of subpoenas. Claire and Grandpa's attorney pushed for formal subpoenas for the shell companies and for every account tied to my father's financial maneuvers. When the subpoenas arrived, They pulled back curtains that had hidden decades of misdirection. The prosecutors began to build a criminal case, charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. I didn't relish the thought of my father in handcuffs, but the law has a way of trimming history to exact measurements. He had given me no other recourse. Public sympathy strangely aligned with my side. People liked the idea of the underdog finally getting real evidence in his hands, and Grandpa's frailty made the story tangible. A grandson fighting to reclaim what had been rightfully his. Talk shows called. A local morning anchor asked to interview me. I said no to most of it. I let Claire and the lawyers speak where public record mattered, because I wanted the truth to be unvarnished and precise. But when I did speak, I tried not to sound like a man reveling in victory. I wanted my words to be sober, enough to justify what I'd done, not to celebrate the man I still had to see at the breakfast table. The final move, the one that made him stumble, was something my father could neither bribe nor bully away. Exposure to the people he thought he mattered to. At the shareholders' meeting, I asked to speak. Grandpa approved. Standing at that podium, with the company's logo buzzed on a screen behind me and my father's eyes trying to melt me with loathing, I told the audience the facts. I did not berate him. I did not indulge in theatrical condemnation. I walked them through the pattern of transfers, showed them the forged invoices, explained how his consulting firms were nothing more than a family of ghosts feeding off a real, tangible future. I pointed to the financials Claire had prepared and let numbers do the unforgiving work of truth. When I finished, someone in the back asked whether the company would pursue restitution, whether there were protections for employees who had unknowingly enabled the fraud. The board promised audits, compliance reforms, and a new transparency policy. The shareholders demanded oversight. The regulators promised to follow the money. My father sat like a man left without an audience. He had always relied on spectacle. Stripped of that, he was only a man with a ledger and no allies. Yet revenge, like any complicated thing, did not leave me feeling cleansed. I had what I wanted. Control of my trust, a path to reclaiming the funds, the board's support. But it also left me with new knowledge of how much damage one grown man can do within the fragile architecture of a family. There were nights when I wandered through the rooms of the Hale house and felt the weight of our story like furniture. I had taken away my father's authority, but I had also taken his dignity. I could see him in the kitchen sometimes, staring at a coffee cup as if it were a problem in algebra he couldn't solve. The legal battle continued. My father pleaded not guilty, which meant a long trial loomed, hearings scheduled like milestones of pain. There were plea negotiations. There were moments when the prosecutor let him offer partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. He tried to bargain his freedom with money he no longer had. The courts did what courts do. They moved with heavy, sometimes frustrating deliberation. In parallel, Claire and the corporate auditors worked to recover assets and reverse transactions. We recovered a portion of the money, less than we hoped, but enough to begin compensating some of the people who had suffered under the misrepresented finances. In private, my mother and I worked to rebuild the practical strands of our lives. We set up a trust management board that included third-party fiduciaries, people with no family ties, because Grandpa wanted to make sure the next generation didn't fall into the same web of misplaced trust. My mother began to make decisions for herself. She signed papers to sell the lake house that had been the emblem of my father's excess. She used part of the proceeds to pay down debts and part to fund a small scholarship in my grandmother's name. It felt like holding the sparks of something kinder. There were moments of strange tenderness. One afternoon, when the trial had taken its first public turn and my father's name was a painful punctuation in news cycles, he knocked on the study door. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Ethan," he said, voice low. "One thing, did I ever tell you I'm proud you're not like me?" Pride is a shape that can fit all sorts of truths. I didn't say what I wanted, how he'd stolen my future, but I heard him. He was trying in his way to explain a life of bad decisions as if they were lessons. I listened, and for a moment the old boy who taught me to ride a bike in Prospect Park blinked through the veneer of the man who'd taught me fiscal conservatism. But there was no reconciliation that erased what had happened. The court eventually sentenced him to a term that fit the crime's gravity, and he went in with the same stoicism he had used to endure the world before his choices collapsed. Jail does not solve everything. It opens new wounds and demands new reckonings. I visited once, a sterile corridor and a small glass room that made conversation sound like it came through water. He apologized, a bare thing, stripped of his old defenses, and the apology sounded like a man learning how to be a different thing. I let him speak and I listened because sometimes people deserve the chance to try to be smaller and truer. As for Grandpa, the disease did what it does, it took. He lingered long enough to see the restoration begin, long enough to watch me sit at a board meeting and speak with a confidence that had once been stone in my shoe. Before he died, he squeezed my hand and said, "You did not break the family. You saved what mattered." His voice trembled on the last syllables. I believed him because Grandpa's approval had always been a compass for me. Flawed, yes, but honest. Revenge had been a ragged road. I had not wanted to be cruel in small, petty ways. I wanted justice. But justice, even when carried out cleanly, is still a kind of violence. It uproots lives, exposes secrets, and forces people into nicked and uncomfortable truths. In the months that followed, I worked to direct the energy that had driven me toward something quieter, rebuilding. I started a small fund to help employees who'd lost retirement contributions when my father's tricks collapsed the books. I volunteered as a mentor for young designers who could use a hand up. I invested in community programs in Morristown that my father had ignored. It felt like tending a garden to replant the scorched soil. People asked if I felt vindicated. The word felt too small for the complicated relief and sorrow braided together. There was satisfaction, yes, some of it cold, some warm, but also an emptiness that follows the extinguishing of a long-burning grievance. The neighborly congratulatory emails tapered off, and life unspooled into the ordinary concerns of rent prices, client deadlines, and grocery lists. My mother learned to laugh again at small things. Grandpa's portrait on the library wall seemed less distant when I passed it in the evening. Not because the past had been erased, but because we had rearranged the furniture of our lives to make room for people who might breathe. Sometimes late at night I imagine a different ledger, one where my father had been honest, where he'd taught me to steward money and not to hide it. That alternate history sits like an unopened book on my shelf. I will never read it. What I did do was choose to use what I had: evidence, allies, law, and a stubbornness born of being underestimated, to hold someone accountable. I took back the future that had been stolen from me and shaped it into a responsibility I would not hand to a man who had not earned it. Years later, when I sat at the head of the Hale Foundation's meeting and signed checks for small causes that mattered, a scholarship for design students, a grant for community clinics, I felt the imprint of everything that had happened. Revenge was a chapter, not the whole book. The story's end did not look like a trophy. It looked like work. It looked like steady, unglamorous repair. It looked like using money to seed something better than resentment, and that, in its way, felt like a justice that could last.